with unbelievers. For what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? Or what fellowship can light have with darkness? What harmony is there between Christ and Belial? Or what does a believer have in common with an unbeliever? What agreement is there between the temple of God and idols? For we are the temple of the living God. As God has said, I will live with them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. Therefore, come out of them and be separate, says the Lord. Touch no unclean thing, and I will receive you. And I will be a father to you, and you will be my son and daughters, says the Lord Almighty. Therefore, since we have these promises, dear friends, let us purify ourselves from everything that contaminates body and spirit, perfecting holiness out of reverence for God.
So I'm hoping that you are here at church today because you want to be. Or at least, if you don't really feel like it, you've come because you think it's a good place to be at church. I'm hoping that because there is no law, as far as I'm aware, that says you have to come. So chances are you're here because you're choosing to be. But there are plenty of people out there who would not choose to come to church because they've had a bad experience at church. Very few people, though, come to church and think, oh, this is a really terrible place, but I'll keep coming back every week. Rather, what happens is this: people come, they think it's good, and slowly, like the famous frog that apparently if you boil it slowly doesn't jump out of the water, without realizing, people get drawn into something that turns out to be bad for them. When leadership goes wrong and people get hurt, you tend to find when it all explodes that a lot of people have been putting up with it or even supporting what's wrong for quite a long time. Well, Paul, in this letter, is writing to a church in the first century where he is very worried that is happening. They have welcomed people to lead their church, and these people are running everything for their own glory. They look very shiny and impressive. But because what they want is their own glory, they want to show everybody how great they are, that means they're nothing like Jesus. Jesus gave away his glory in order to lift other people up. Jesus gave away his riches in order to make other people rich. Jesus gave away his power in order to serve others. But that is not how this church in Corinth is being led. And Paul has been saying, look, for leaders like Jesus, that's who you need to look for. People who give away what they have in order for other people to know God. Not people who promote themselves. And now in this section, as Zoe's just read to us, he is upping the pressure. He isn't just saying, oh, it isn't great to not have good leaders. Try and get some better ones. He's saying, you can't. You can't, as a church, give power to people who are not actually true believers in Jesus. Even if they're very gifted, very slick, very clever. But if they're unlike Jesus himself, they'll be leading you, dragging you away from Jesus himself. And this, I think, is the surprising thing. He's saying to the church, this church in Corinth, the whole church, it's your responsibility. The responsibility of the whole church to make sure that doesn't happen. So here's the first thing that we see in this passage. The church is God's temple. Don't let us ruin it. Tom, I don't have anything to move these on, so you'll have to do that. Yeah, it's the next slide after that. As I was saying to the children, there is an amazing bit in the Old Testament, the first part of the Bible, before Jesus came, where God's people build a temple, a place where they can meet with God, and they have to be very careful what happens in that building because God is utterly holy and separate and different to them. And it's all set up, and Solomon the king prays, and a cloud of God's glory fills the temple. He's present there with them. Imagine what it was like to be there. A place for God to live. His actual presence filling the room. Back in the 90s, we used to sing a worship song about it. We used to say to God, let your glory fall like on that ancient day. We're longing for that intense, tangible feeling of God's glory. And in fact, sometimes Christians so long for that, they try to hype it up. They try to create it by emotional atmosphere. But Paul says here in this bit we've just read today, that personal, real, tangible knowledge of God is available to every Christian all the time. You see in verse 16 he says the temple is now us. If you've trusted Jesus, God himself, by his Spirit, comes into your life and lives there. Paul quotes in verse 16 an Old Testament promise. I will live with them and walk among them. I will be their God and they will be my people. When you trust Jesus, you enter the closest possible relationship with God. If you're here today and you're not a Christian, just to be clear, that is the offer. The offer is not a better life or a moral way of living. The offer is that God himself will come and live in you and with you if you trust in Jesus. But still, while we know that's true, you might be thinking, yeah, okay, except that Paul says it must be right. But how do I get the cloud? How do I get the glory? Well, Paul's been saying in this book, the way God revealed himself is through Jesus giving himself up for us. That is the ultimate revealing of God. That is the ultimate glory of God. His character is this self-giving love. And so I think what he's saying is you should experience that in the way that all these people who know God treat you. We together are the temple of God. The glory of Jesus is seen in his self-giving love. And we show that to each other. We are the temple. Now, if you're a Christian, you're part of the church, God's global church, you will somewhat know that, I think. You will think back and think there are moments where the self-giving love of someone inhabited by God brings his nature close to me. You'll have experienced it sometime. Or something else will have happened. You will have done now what comes naturally to you, and you will have loved someone else and put them first. And instead of saying thank you to you, what do they say? They say, oh, I'm thanking God for you. Because they know it's God's presence. It's God's glory in this temple. As Paul says, we are the temple of the living God. As God promised, he is the Father and we are his sons and daughters, entirely welcomed by God so completely that he takes up residence in our lives and we reflect his family likeness to one another. But here's the question, and it's really the question Paul's asking here. Why are some churches, or maybe all churches some of the time, why are they not like that? Maybe that's been your experience. The church has not got the glory that God shows us through Jesus dying for us. Now, sometimes people make that judgment about a church in a stupid way. They say, oh, the music wasn't great, or the lights weren't very flashy, or the speaker wasn't very interesting. Listen, there are churches without any of those things where the glory and presence of God, humble people who live for God, his sons and daughters are loving each other. That's very clear in many places without anything flashy. But there are definitely places where the real glory of God is not present. There's a lack of care, or a lack of fellowship and love. Maybe even worse, outright gossip. competition, or worse still, actual cruelty or abuse. Whose fault is that, and why does it happen? When the church is not a temple marked by a close fellowship with the God of justice and a commitment to his grace and holiness, when the church is not a family with the perfect Heavenly Father, what's going on? Well, first of all, it's the responsibility of the person with power who is doing bad things. People are doing bad things in church. They are morally responsible for that. If me, or one of the other leaders of this church, uses the power we have to do bad things to treat this precious gathering as anything apart from the temple that belongs to God, his children, if anybody doesn't behave in that way, that person is wrong. And Paul has been warning the church against people like that, saying, don't listen to them. But do you see here, Paul is also saying to this whole church in Corinth, all of you don't be yoked with unbelievers. He's saying to them, you have a responsibility not to let people who themselves aren't spiritual, who aren't committed to walking with God, who aren't ambassadors for the true gospel in what they say and do, you all have a responsibility not to let people like that have influence over you. Do not be yoked with unbelievers. Quite a famous verse. A yoke is a thing you put on an animal to guide it. So you put it on its shoulders and then you use that to sort of steer. Sorry if you're a farmer. I'm sure it's more complicated than that. We don't have many farmers in central Liverpool. But he's saying to the whole church, don't let influences that are not from God pull the church away from what is right. In their church, it was a very cosmopolitan, fashionable city, a centre of power, centre of sophistication. It seems like the leaders were saying, we need more powerful leadership where you get bossed about a bit, but also we don't really want to be too sort of strong about morality, because that would be very unfashionable where we are. So we want this strange mixture of like strong leaders who are impressive, but also keep quiet about things that might offend people. That can be true today. And he's saying here, of course, the unbelieving leaders are culpable for what they do. But you, church, step up. Don't go along with what is wrong. Don't be guided and dragged by what comes from the world and not from God. As he has said, do make room in your heart for the right type of leadership. Absolutely, therefore, do not let the wrong type of leadership guide you. Don't have fellowship with what isn't from God. He really ups the ante. He says, do God and Satan have fellowship with each other? That's what Belial means. He's like, no, of course they don't. So you don't have that type of fellowship either. Now, let's talk about what this might mean today. We're going to move from most extreme to least extreme. In the most extreme cases, where terrible abuse has been visited by churches on children and vulnerable people, the people doing the abuse are obviously the guilty ones. But I wonder if you ever read about that, you discover there's always a story about other people who suspected or even knew. But they thought, oh, because that person is a respected leader, I don't want to undermine God's work, or I'm too scared to take them on. But listen, someone who is repeatedly and deliberately damaging children within what should be God's temple should not be influencing anyone's behaviour. Do not be yoked to that. What fellowship can light have with that type of darkness? What fellowship does that work of Satan have with Christ? Less extreme version. I was talking to someone recently who was pretty convinced that a senior leader in their church group, in their denomination, was not a Christian. Sort of shrugged his shoulders and said, yeah, people get ahead in our church, even though they're not Christians themselves. Like, no. If that's the case, you've got to use whatever influence you have to not let that happen. And if you're stuck there, you've got to work very hard not to let that person influence you or the direction of your church. Stop being passive. Don't be yoked with that. Closer to home. In some cases of church leadership gone wrong, and people have got hurt, that I've been close to, I couldn't say whether the people who did the bad things were actually unbelievers or not. I couldn't judge that. But it was obvious to everybody that the idea of or concept of leadership going on was not Christian at all. The leader as the servant of the congregation, as Paul's been describing, that was not what was going on. The leader to be listened to only insofar as they reflect the words and character of Jesus, that principle was not being applied. The leader doing hard sacrificial things so that people can hear and understand. No, I've been in lots of situations where the leader was the corporate manager or the honoured guest or the authoritarian preacher. The world's concept of what a leader is has sneaked into the church, and we should not be yoked to that. We shouldn't go along with it. I should have said more when things didn't feel right. What about right here in our context? To be clear, my conviction is we don't have any actual unbelieving leaders in our church. So, good. But here's something that happened recently. Recently in church, I gave a notice about something, and someone in church did the right thing. They came to me very gently, very politely, and said, felt a little bit like you were trying to make the church seem more big and successful than it actually is. Felt a bit like secular marketing. Felt a bit like you were doing something a bit dishonest to make people think the church is something that is not. Do you see what they were saying? They were saying, you're using a way that is of the world, not of God. Those things shouldn't have fellowship. And so I was grateful for the challenge, even though I didn't think I meant that. But if that was what was coming across, well, it's the church's job to say we won't be dragged away by that. Now, I just want to be clear about a couple of things. I don't think we should think we have nothing to learn from people who aren't Christians. That would be very dangerous. There are lots of books about leadership, or training about safeguarding, or help with technical issues. We need the help of the world with those things. But we need to realize every single thing in the world that's produced has an agenda. And if it's not an agenda to promote Jesus, it's an agenda to do something else. And we need to wear glasses to make sure that the world's agenda is not dragging us away from our commitment, as Paul says in 7 verse 1, to reverence, fear of the Lord, to be pure and right before him. So I read a book recently that's very useful to me, a book called Atomic Habits. Some people have read it. It's about becoming a more productive person. I think it's fine to read that, as long as I don't start teaching you that the ultimate aim of being a human being is to be productive and useful and successful. That would be graceless. That would be Christless. That would be dragging you away from the gospel. So we can learn from the world, we must, but we must not be yoked to that, dragged away from the heart of our fellowship being about walking with Jesus. And here, it's your responsibility, as well as mine, to not let the precious place of God's presence that this is become pulled in a different direction by the world. That's why in our church we have membership, so you can formally join as a member, and then you actually get to say what you think about things, to vote about things. That's why it's an important thing to us. But generally, I think many people in our culture today just treat church like it's a sort of passive experience. You know, if things are not going the right way, it's just my fault, or the other leader's fault, or the staff team's fault. And Paul is just not up for that view of the church. He says, all of you, don't let yourself be dragged in the wrong direction by things that come from not God, but from the world. So that's the first thing. We are God's temple. The second thing is this: you are God's temple. Let the right people into your heart. Listen, I've got a little business tip for you today. I don't know much about business, but here's a little tip that I have observed by surfing the internet. If you want to make money and you like controlling people, it seems to be very easy to start a cult. It seems in this day and age to be very straightforward. It's amazing to me what people will put up with and give their money to. Go onto YouTube and search for Christian content. You will find an endless succession of grifters who don't display any of the characteristics that Paul has been describing in 2 Corinthians. And even if they might sort of make out that they are, you can't possibly know that they are because they're on the internet. So you can't possibly know anything about what they're actually like. And I was watching some of these things the other day. I won't even get into the rubbish I was watching. I stopped in the end. It was getting my nerves. And I was thinking, what is the appeal of it? What's the appeal of this person who's clearly making lots of money by distorting the gospel? Why are they so popular? I mean, they had something like 800,000 followers. Well, Paul has said a few times to the Corinthian Christians about himself, make room for us in your hearts. We're used to thinking of our heart just being about our emotions. Our heart in the Bible is the center of your life, your will, yourself, the true you. And Paul says, listen, there is something or someone or groups of people forming your heart. He's saying who you really are as a person is being formed by something, or probably some things, or some people. What you think matters, what gets your blood pumping, what gets you going, that is being formed by something or other, Paul is saying. And I don't think it's possible, or that Paul is suggesting, you can withdraw from the world. So you can't stop the influences of the world being near you. But, he says, you can control what you're yoked to. You can control what's leading you. You can control what you are fellowshipping with. That word means like a deep level of agreement with. You can choose what to be in harmony with. Because make no mistake, your heart is being formed by something. You're letting someone in there to the deepest part of you. And Paul is saying, don't let that be formed by people and ideas that hate Jesus and are against him. Because there is no fellowship between God and Satan. Instead, find the people who love Jesus and love you and serve wholeheartedly and really let those people into your hearts. Let me give you an example of what I mean. I think of a good friend who was talking to me a little while ago, who's had a series of relationships with people who were not good for her, a series of romantic relationships. And all the people around her were saying, why do you keep doing this? Choosing such rubbish men. And as we as her friends talked to her, it came to the surface that she was saying, I just can't imagine not being in a romantic relationship. And why is that, we said? Well, a lot of talking, a lot of praying, a lot of thinking about it. In the end, she said this, I don't feel worthy and loved unless someone is really into me. Now listen, I realise that lie is everywhere. Every film and book and soap opera is saying the point of life is a romantic sexual relationship, and a series of really good ones of those is a way to have a successful life. But the idea that that is where your worth comes from as a Christian is a lie. It is a lie from the mouth of Satan. It is a lie from the pit of hell. You are valuable and worthy and loved and a gift to the church and a gift to the world the way God has made you. You do not need a person to tell you that. And in fact, if you get yoked to that lie, I'm only valuable if there's a person in my life who's really into me, you will, as happened to my friend, get dragged away from Jesus. But there are relationships, friendships, fellowships you should be searching out and looking for and welcoming. Find all sorts of people, older than you, younger than you, single, married, who are making their life's work to point to Jesus, and welcome them into your life. They're often unimpressive. They are, like Paul has described himself, they seem to have nothing, but in fact, because of Christ, they possess everything. Find those people and really open your hearts to them. If their life's purpose is to serve Jesus, let them shape you. Let them into your heart. Let them form your personality. Classic application of this passage, it's often used, is to teach that Christians shouldn't marry people who aren't Christians. Well, I think they probably shouldn't, but I'm not sure this passage is about that. It probably is true you can't successfully marry someone and not have them shape your heart, your inmost person. If you're really doing marriage properly, the other person will have that effect on you. So it would be wise to choose someone who trusts Jesus. But making it about that, as it's often quoted, limits the application to all of us that we all need to think about, which is this. Where are we swapping? Where are we letting people and ideas and things that are wrong influence us away from the presence of God? Where are we letting unclean things, which you can't avoid being in contact with because we live in the world, but where are we letting those things shape us? Where are we letting those wrong things into our hearts? When we have the opportunity to let servant-hearted, Jesus-like people into our hearts to shape who we are. You know, there are Christians who are sort of really into worldly stuff, whether it's money or success or their kids doing well, whatever it is. And how we live is that we just do most things as if God is not present with us, as if God is not our Father. Well, if that's the way you're living, you are yoked to something. But it will be not ideas from Jesus, but from the world. Let me give you 3 little examples of where I've seen this crop up. A little while ago, one of our mission partners went abroad, but she was still in the WhatsApp group of her small group. And she's abroad now in a country where it's very hard for Christians to meet. But she was still in the WhatsApp group. And I do think the person who put this in the group is still in our church, or else I wouldn't use it as an illustration. But someone in the WhatsApp group, on the night the group was on at home, put in the group, I'm feeling a bit tired tonight, so instead of going to meet with a small group, I'm just going to chill out with Netflix. Now, can you see? There you have the starkest of choices there. You have the choice to go and be with people who are there because they want to love you and serve you and form your personality towards you. I mean, that's why people go. They want to do that for other people. Or you can soak in a whole lot of secular ideas that have nothing to do with it. It's your choice. That's why we talk in this church about something called cultural engagement. We're not just trying to be cool. If we were, you'd see it's not succeeding. We're not just trying to be trendy by saying we're culturally engaged. We have that responsibility to be, you can't avoid the news or television. You can't only read Christian books. So we need to be equipped to put on our glasses and say, that idea that's teaching me, I don't want that in my heart. One of the things we do here at church, you may or may not have picked it up, is that if you become a member of the church, you get an elder whose job it is, under God, to pray for you and meet with you once a year to talk about your Christian life and pray with you and disciple you. And we take that on as a job. It's not unusual for people who have that job in the church to try and set up those meetings, and people in church to say, no, I don't want that. Why would you not want that? Okay, if we are being intimidating or scary or using our power wrongly, maybe that's why you wouldn't want it. But then, remember the first point, it's your job as the church to put out there that we're doing that and self-correct. But if that's not the reason, really often the reason is this: I just don't really want this person speaking to the deepest bit of my life. And Paul says, listen, then you're just going to be yoked to unbelievers. If there's someone there who is Jesus-like and loves you, make room in your hearts for them. I remember once before I was at Christ Church, just to be clear, I was in a ministry job and I didn't feel like the people I was working with were treating me very well. And so I ended up getting very angry and bitter, and I think that was coming out in the way that I was working with them. And then I remember talking to a friend and really ranting about this and saying, I don't deserve to be treated this way. She said, you're right, that's not what you deserve. What you deserve is God's eternal judgment. I was like, all right, not the comfort I was looking for. But she was making a good point. She was saying the idea that these people you're working with here are here to tell you that you're great and pump up your self-esteem and make you feel better, that is a really bad lie. I know it's what the world's telling you all the time. You're the most important, you're really great, everyone should make a fuss of you. It's a lie. The truth is you're there to serve those people, to be their servant. Being a servant is not a glamorous task for which people appreciate you. What matters, Paul has been saying, is that there's no stumbling block to anyone getting to Jesus that is more important than me feeling important. Instead, when I'm struggling with that type of thing, which I'm sure you do too, I say to myself, listen, God lives in me now. He doesn't have fellowship with darkness. I have the security and love and care of God my Father. I am Christ's ambassador. Stop bringing fellowship with this worldly, selfish, wrong idea that people should be worshipping me. When people actually abandon living or teaching Christian ethics or abandon Jesus altogether, I often look and it's observable that they didn't have a group of Christ-like people they were actually welcoming into their hearts to shape who they are. They never have had that. Instead, Paul says in chapter 7, verse 1, make God the one you revere, the one whose view you care about. And so purify yourself. Continue in the path of being set apart he's given us. I think that verse will come up on the screen. See what he says? Seeing as we have this great promise that God lives with us and in us, and he is our Father, and he is purifying us. Since we have those promises, dear friends, people that I love, let's get rid of the stuff that's contaminating that devotion. Instead, because we revere God, let's move towards holiness, purity. People who lead badly are responsible. But people choose poor leaders because they have been discipled by the world instead of Jesus. We are the temple of the living God. So brothers and sisters, let us purify ourselves from everything that contaminates. Let's aim towards holiness because we don't revere the world. We revere God.